The bus stopped at the edge of the green. It was a dark winter evening. Helen still had a 20-minute walk home. It's thought that she switched on her strategy, her leftover coping mechanism.
Bears. Wild boars, maybe. That rustling crack closing in must be animal. I'll pretend it's animal.
Now, back on stage, I lift my buttocks high, bend knees, open thighs, shuffle sideways, head turned this way, that way. Someone jeers, someone touches, while my eyes reflect their cash and £10 plastic cards.
The main east way out of town is currently closed in 2 different places due to a crash and police incident, causing heavy traffic queues to build in both locations. Around a mile of traffic is trapped.
In an ideal world, I'd buy a bigger place, a place where us girls could work together. There's safety in numbers, not afraid of getting busted or being murdered.
I refuse to compromise my safety, Crystal said, inviting strangers back to her room. But nights were always hard for Crystal. She talked about a safety in jeopardy.
I remember standing on a street corner eating BLT on rye, thinking about my fluid intake. But sod that. I still aimed for the 3 crowns. Ordered fruit juice. Well, gin, vodka, a small, warm whiskey. It was just another evening, drear, overcast.
So we just watched the trailer for the poetry film, In an Ideal World, I'd Not Be Murdered, and it's directed by Chaucer Cameron. And we do have Chaucer with us today. Welcome, Chaucer. And we also have Helen. Helen, you edited the film? Yes.
Yes.
And today I'm really thankful to all our guests who joined our panel. Really proud and very thankful to Kiera, Nidhi, and Georgia. Before we get on to questions and reflections on the film, I would really love everybody to introduce themselves. Please introduce yourselves. Let us know which city you're logging in from and what you do, what you're passionate about. We're going to start with Chaucer, and then Helen, and Kiera, Nidhi, and Georgia. Chaucer?
Hello, it's lovely to meet you all. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'd like to say that Helen made the film, produced the film, and did did all of it. I wrote the book and collaborated with her on it like that. So I'm an author of In an Ideal World, I'd Not Be Murdered, which is part memoir, part fiction. I'm primarily a poet, and I work independently in collaboration with Helen Dewberry. I've also produced a couple of short poetry films myself, and conceived and facilitated Wild Whispers, an international film poetry project that started with one poem and led to 14 versions in 10 languages and 12 poetry films. And that was my creative response to a particular political upheaval, which was Brexit. And it was also a creative response to a personal traumatic event that compromised my safety and forced Helen and I to have to move geographical location to another area, which was a significant loss. So preparing for this panel has been useful for tracing the themes and threads in our work. And I noticed all our long poetry films that we've made, such as Nothing in the Garden, Wild Whispers, and In an Ideal World. All these had something in common, which was a direct response to various forms of violence and censorship. I've since used a poetry film as part of my practice in order to explore challenging and complex narratives and issues surrounding censorship, violence, prostitution, or sex work, loss and mental health. My desire to connect has always been informed by personal and political events. And I'm passionate, very, very passionate about poetry film and consider it to be a perfect vehicle for exciting collaborations and for fostering strong positive connections between countries, cultures, and across the world.
Thank you, Chaucer. Helen?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Helen Dewberry. Thanks for inviting me back onto a panel again this month. It's nice to meet other panelists. I'm looking forward to discussions. So I'm a poetry filmmaker, editor and writer. And my main collaboration is with poets, in particular with Chaucer, as she's just mentioned. So I think the film we made, In an Ideal World or Not Be Murdered, it's really more of a collaboration rather than anything else in terms of who directed it or produced it and that type of thing. Collaboration was really at the heart of it. Teaching poetry film is something I'm very passionate about. It's part of my practice, and I'm particularly interested in enabling people's own capacity to tell their own stories. And so that takes up quite a bit of my time. So yeah, thanks again.
Thank you, Helen. Kiera?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I am a feminist poet and a scholar. I'm the current Michael Ridley postdoctoral scholar in digital humanities at the University of Guelph. And there I study the feminization and subsequent denigration of women's writing and the associated publishing technologies. And with my poetry, I strive to bring my creative practices into conversation with my scholarly work. So my poetry often focuses on themes like motherhood, as well as the day-to-day experience of women and girls. And during the pandemic, I started to experiment with short poetry films that I would create on my iPhone. And I've just continued those experimentations since. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Kiera. Nidhi?
Hi, everyone. It's so nice and lovely to meet you all. My name is Nidhi. I am also a scholar. I'm assistant teaching professor at Sacred Heart University. And my work, just building on what you have said, that, I write about and I research and I work with representations of women who had experienced gendered violence during the partition and how that is represented in cinema, as well as popular culture. Along with that, I also collaborate with the 1947 Partition Archive. So I'm currently looking at testimonies from that era, trying to see if there were more women speaking out about their experiences of gendered violence and stuff. So that's what my main project is. But other than that, I also teach poetry as well. So I teach about the similar themes about trauma, loss, and most of it related, again, because I work on partition, so we explore different genocides and Holocaust and whatever. So most of it is like taught in that way. So it's both in my teaching practice as well as my research. It's about trying to unveil underrepresented voices and trying to as well as explain the silences and like why the silences exist in the archives or in cinema and so forth. So that's what my research is on. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure, Nidhi. Georgia?
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Georgia Hertz, and I'm a recent MFA graduate of Carlow University in the United States. I was focusing on nonfiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry, and sort of their intersection. My thesis was a memoir about being raised in the American South. I currently live in North Carolina. As a woman, as a creative individual, as someone who has had, many different experiences as a woman, for better or for worse, and unpacking mental illness, trauma through the creative lens. I do visual art as well as music. I'm a music teacher full time, and my poetry and my songs are really focused on place and geography and how geography influences creativity. And I find that sort of thing fascinating. So that's what I've been working on lately. I also work with Samita on a piece of fiction that has been ongoing for many years now.
Yeah, Georgie and I have been writing for almost 9 years.
Oh, sorry.
Finally met in person this year. So,
Yes.
well, this year it's 2024. It's 2025 right now. And yeah, really excited to be here. I'm Samita Nandi from the Center for Media and Celebrity Studies, sponsoring the Wall of Fame Film Festival. It's not just an annual festival, it's a festival community, and I host screenings and panels for ethical filmmakers and all creative practitioners for human rights, animal rights, environmental sustainability, such as climate change, which is an important issue right now. And yeah, I'm really, really proud of all creative practitioners, who represent, who, offer, who share their stories in so many different ways. We're gonna take a look at Kira's family video shortly. But first, I wanted to share some questions and reflections on Chaucer's poetry film. Chaucer, what inspired you to do this film?
Well, the inspiration for it came about many years ago. I started writing the book. Quite a few years ago, and it took a long period of time to write, because traumatic experiences are often received in delay, and it took over 30 years to achieve the emotional distance that was needed to be able to reflect through these events in my poetry. And so the genesis of the book, before the film, but the genesis of the book started many years ago when I wrote a monologue called The Raid, which was staged in the Everyman Theatre in Cheltenham in the UK. And it was based on a police raid on a brothel in 1978 in Streatham, hosted by Cynthia Payne. Cynthia was a celebrity madam at the time. She was my madam. In 2016, I wrote Brothel Keeping in Suburbia, and that was the beginning of the book. And that poem didn't go into the pamphlet, but it was a start. And then I attended a writing group in London, and that took me back to all the old haunts like Farley Road, Clissold Park, King's Cross, which are in the poems are in the film, and In an Ideal World was born then. But regarding specific scenarios that led up to deciding to do the film, in terms of the book's development, there were 3 significant triggers. So I was working on a poetry film collection in collaboration with Helen, and I thought it was about adoption. But I discovered later that they were all prostitution poems. And so I'd been writing undercover, even to myself. And I'd argue that that form of self-censorship is one of the most damaging aspects of prostitution. When it compromises or distorts one's creativity. And it did that for me. It was quite a shock to realise that it had been doing that. So once I identified that these poems were prostitution poems, I knew that there was a book and a film coming. And the second trigger was that, Cynthia Payne died in 2015. She had a celebrity status, which the newspapers enhanced by saying that she was a madam who sold her girls for luncheon vouchers. And I was one of those girls. And of course, there was the hypocrisy and outcry surrounding her sentence in Holloway Prison, which was appealed. So the third trigger was recently finding out about the suicide of my psychotherapist, Roger Teo, who worked in Hackney Hospital, which is now closed in London. And that had been an abusive situation, a sexual abusive situation. So in the wake of Me Too, I went to the police and they discovered that he had killed himself. He'd taken his life back in the 80s. And so all of these experiences came together as a catalyst, all these deaths of these people that had been keeping me quiet and silencing me. That shifted, and like a big catalyst, it all came out. My writing changed completely significantly afterwards. I started writing narratively with characters, which I didn't understand why I was doing that. But I was writing in that way. A book came out quite quickly. And then working with Helen, we decided to make the film from that angle as well. So it needed those deaths, and it needed that shift because I'd been working under the oppressive state and I hadn't realised I had, and how it affects your creativity. So that's really, really important for that to be out there, I think.
Yeah, I love the creative process, how it started off as a monologue, and everything you're saying, like the poetry, the film, they're all interrelated. So that's very inspiring to know, and also all the political prompts you had, and on the personal level too, like the suicide. That's very challenging too, but it's interesting how one triggers another. Any questions or thoughts from our panelists, Kiera, Georgia, Nidhi, Helen?
Yeah, I have kind of a question for you. So while you are creating your poetry, you're obviously dealing with a lot of personal trauma and very personal experiences. And you talked about sort of getting some space away from that. But I just wonder more broadly how you manage that process, because diving into that creatively can be very difficult, right? Even if you have some time, it is difficult, even if you have some time and distance from the traumatic event.
Yes, it is. You do need that distance to process it all, it's quite a challenging and dangerous area to work in, and so. Filming it was very different to writing the book. Writing the book seemed to be a breeze against filming it. And filming it was really important because it brought a different aspect to it. So I can perform and read my book okay, although I do get, a bit sort of unwell maybe after, but then filming and watching the film is a completely different experience. And it's sort of led to some PTSD. So for me, for example, how poetry and film can work together is through the act of participation. So as you saw in the trailer, I feature in the film. However, to complicate things regarding traumatic memories, I admit I was naive in thinking that I'd not be impacted by going back to those geographical areas. And so to a certain extent, writing in An Ideal World has been both a radical experience and a violent experience. But the radical violence has been vital. It's integral to the work. It's been generative and transformational. And indeed, the Welsh writer and poet Gwyneth Lewis said in an interview recently about her book, and I recommend it, called The Nightshade Mother. She said, she was poet laureate in Wales. She said, I know that poetry is an all benign therapy, and as well as being a cathartic form of self-expression, it can also give insights that a person isn't ready psychologically to handle. So if it can heal, she says, it can also harm. And that for me is actually spot on, somebody saying that. I completely understand that concept. However, creatives tend to live on the edge of things in that uncomfortable heterotopic space, constantly pushing boundaries. And poetry film, or the process of creating a poetry film, does include a certain elasticity of boundaries that can, on occasion, snap back. Yeah. And I certainly can give loads of examples about how that happens and what it looks like and how it feels like.
I think making
challenging process. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, making the film, one of the things that we started off with one main question really, and that was how to visually in poetry film represent these traumatic experiences in particular, without re-traumatizing for anyone watching it or the people involved, so Chaucer herself, without fetishizing or stereotyping. And you see those latter two every time you turn the television on. So it was really important to find ways of doing it without doing those three things: re-traumatizing, fetishizing, and stereotyping.
Yeah, thank you, Helen, for sharing. Georgia, any thoughts?
There, I'm not muted anymore. When you mentioned geographic locations and the PTSD that has since been returned to you, do you have thoughts on, can you expand upon that sentiment of the location, the place informs the content that you've created, or do you think it's more tied to emotional locations and past memories versus geographic place?
Yeah, I think a bit of both, actually. I didn't know what I'd signed up for when I decided, it said I'd be to go be in it. And I actually went back to one of the locations in London because we needed to give an authentic connection to the actual place where we remembered events, where those events took place. And one of them was outside 128 Fardy Road, a significant area, which used to be the entrance of a brothel that I was in. And actually the experience evoked, by going outside, the experience evoked a ghostly phenomena. I saw it. I evoked a manifestation of a person standing by me that had happened in the past. But what what I didn't know at the time, what I couldn't evoke, was the person that was standing outside the building had a dog in the past in my memory, which I've written about, and for me, my memory was clear. You know, that dog was there. It was there to do what it was going to do, which was going to kill us. And so but I couldn't evoke the dog. And it wasn't until became home, and Helen then made the film and showed it and screened it on in a safe place in our house, and she put the dog barking inside the brothel. So there was the sound of the dog was barking inside the brothel, and that did something. It sort of blew me away completely. It was a very emotional few weeks with that, because what it did, I suddenly realised that the dog had been real, and that, you know, memory is very slippery. Traumatic memory is very slippery, and it's used against you in law courts because you haven't remembered accurately and stuff. But of course you don't, and so. I began to disappear and think that the dog wasn't real, and that I'd made it all up, and that I was going mad and losing my mind. And then Helen, just putting that dog back, opened up a compartment in my head, and I knew for an absolute fact that Alsatian had been there. And it was very important to get the right barking dog noise too. So. Yeah, those were very, very important, and I see those spaces as heterotropic spaces outside those areas where you're, you know, the liminal areas where you're crossing it over, and they're very important areas, really. And I also see that as within the prostitution, a prostituted body is a heterotropic space as far as I'm concerned, and how you use that. So all of this, and the poetry film has generated more material to look at specifics of the dysfunction that happens for women, and for people, for men and women and whatever, to go through if they are involved in that.
Thank you, Cameron. We're going to take a look at Kira's video soon. But before that, Nidhi, any thoughts or reflections on Cameron's work? And talked about the creative process, and, you know, the significance of a geographical location, and also, like, you know, the role that time plays over time, I guess. You know, sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it's later. Nidhi, any thoughts or questions or reflections?
So because I work on, well, it's funny you mentioned Me Too, because Me Too plays a very interesting role in the work that I do, because it kind of questions the culture of silence so predominantly. And I also thought that when you were talking about memory studies and how memory plays a role in creativity, was what I was sort of trying to make sense of, because when I was growing up, poetry, like I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed things like Shakespeare and things, but I wasn't um, I wasn't that drawn to it until I came across Charlotte Delbo's work, and then and that transformed the way how I saw things and how I thought poetry itself. And it was all about trauma and survival, and it was free form. And I think what I loved about your film was that it made me want to buy the book to actually, like, kind of, you know, to see, and then go back and see it again to see how it complemented each other, and like how these two, how the intertextuality of trauma worked. So to me, those were my immediate, like, reactions regarding it. And I think, like, when you're talking about such a sensitive topic and such a heartbreak, you know, like when we think about sex work and prostitution and so forth, I think it does not get talked about as much. So to see poetry film or to see poetry as a way to convey that is, I think, very meaningful and powerful because it allows for because it feels like you're taking us in that journey, and I felt that I was with you as you were speaking, and when I saw those places. So now whenever we're in London next, I would like to curiously be like, okay, like this is something that's um familiar, but also just trying to think about how poetry and trauma constantly work. Back in 2019, I did a conference on sexual and gendered violence in Prague, and it was just all people who had worked on different fields like about it. And I came across somebody who did bibliotherapy. So what they would do is that they would use art as a way to talk about trauma through sexual violence, and have kids draw their experiences and stuff. And I kept on thinking about how poetry kind of also has a similar function, that like because it doesn't have a form, it allows for that sort of creative output, because there's not really a correct way to do it as a medium. And I think that's what the idea, and then the fact that it can be adapted into a film makes it even better, because now it's more visual, and visual is more accessible in many ways. I think, especially for people who don't have, for whatever reason, it's just more, I guess, part entertainment, but also part access to have that conversation, to go back into, to think about the memory and trauma and so forth. So I don't know how like coherent I sounded, but that's the best.
No, it's early in the morning here.
Well,
I know I'm still waking up, and
so I don't know how coherent I sounded, but those were my initial thoughts. Like, I hope I can like write it.
It's very important
ahead,
that a number of people have said about reading the book, reading the book first and then doing the film. But it's vital, absolutely. So it was fine having the book and having it out there and you put it on your shelf and whatever. But the film is absolutely vital, integral, and having the right person to make that. I mean, I'm not precious with my stuff. I can give it to people, but it showed me about collaboration, and Helen had to be that person, because she knows more about me than I do, because I can disassociate, especially talking about the difficult stuff. I disassociate, and Helen fills in those gaps and can fill in and take those gaps, and then she puts those into the film. I can often say to her, how did you know that? How could you do that? How could you, how? And she's done it, and it adds another layer to the poem. And then sometimes I write another poem, which is another sequence to it. It informs it. I don't think there's anything else so important. I mean, it's so, prostitution, sex work, and everything is an important subject to be speaking about, because it's not something that is spoken about too much, but it's everywhere. Helen is the film was just brilliant, absolutely brilliant to do. I can't thank her enough for doing it. Have you got anything to say, Helen?
And
Thank you.
I want to add a little bit more. That to me, I think what you just said was something that I do care about, is how we represent trauma ethically, right? And so how do we, and how is it? Because sometimes, like, one of the things that I come across in my work is that how do you represent rape, right? And how do filmmakers or authors, like, how are they depicting rape? And a lot of the discussion, at least in literary scholarship, has been, well, it's not the visualization and the fetishization that, Helen, you mentioned, it's the aftermath of the survivorship, right? And aftermath of and then I think that's what I loved about this film, because it was more like a walk through and a journey through that memories. And I think I'm trying to like heal and using that as a way to heal, but making sure that it is something that's ethically represented. And how does one go about doing it when it's such a difficult topic? So
well, with one that you didn't see in the trailer was Hina, which is the hardest one to talk about and to write and to read, and Helen did it beautifully. I mean, we used a mannequin and we covered it with flowers and stuff, and it wasn't to say that it was beautiful, but it just I mean, Helen can talk, talk much better than I can on it. Is that, what was your choice with Hina?
Yeah, I don't know, that just kind of happened, really. But what I would say, though, in the biggest sort of, not exactly a compliment, but something that was affirming that we'd done something right with this film is we showed it at a venue in London, and somebody was reviewing it afterwards, and they said that they said generally how important it was, and then they said that they hadn't had that experience themselves, but they imagine that anyone who had would be greatly not comforted, I forget the word now, but greatly helped by seeing it. And so that was somebody who wasn't saying, "Oh yeah, we all understand," but they were commenting that if you had been in that position, then it would do something positive and something good. And every venue that we've shown it, somebody's come up and said, "That's kind of my story too," which I think is really important in all the work that we do, in all any abusive or violent situations, either happening now or a memory. And so, yeah, that doesn't answer your question exactly, but that's what I wanted to say in response to it.
Yeah, I have similar experiences at the film festival where, we showcase full versions of short films, and a lot of them have to do with trauma and healing, and how those stories are not personal to the filmmaker anymore, and they're actually more meaningful in a greater collective space. And the responses that I've received, they have been really illuminating, and both for the filmmaker and also for me as the curator. I feel like there's no end to the film. The viewership of the film, even after the film is completed, continues, and hence the story continues. And so it's very multiple, open-ended, and that's something what I particularly like about poetry film is like I feel like there's that aspect of open-endedness, and it's not really about perfection, like a clear closure all the time. But of course, it depends, from story to story. We do have another poetry video from Kiera. We're gonna watch that now, and then we're gonna continue our talk. So just bear for a couple of seconds again. I'll be right back. We're gonna watch Kiera's video, and then we're gonna speak on it.
Watching us grow and learn and play. My mother hides behind the camera. She has lost herself to motherhood, that long-awaited venture of dirty diapers and cracked nipples and sleepless nights. Surrounded by trees and fields and the noise of the 401, she spends her days watching us grow and learn and play. We are difficult children, and she is mostly alone, out here in the wilderness with only the Schneider's sign and the highway to keep her company. Gravel pits buzz with the sound of trucks pulling in and out. I forget to look both ways and am nearly hit. Her voice screams my name and I run, her fear piercing my ears as anger. When summer ends, we bring the playhouse inside and fill it tight with every toy we own. Look, Mom, we cleaned up, we say. We are jubilant, triumphant. She has no energy left to hide the despair. She cries, spends hours carefully putting every item back in its place, collapses, exhaustion taking root. She drinks coffee and dyes her hair brown and wears red and yellow sandals and looks beautiful and polished. She keeps us healthy, happy, as she falls further into the legacy of her lineage, combating isolation and shame with dry whites and the occasional gin and tonic, hiding more than herself behind the camera. Her voice, the only traces left on film.
So we just watched a family video by Kiera, and yeah, it's beautifully done. I watched it for the second time, and I noticed a little difference between Kiera's video and Chaucer's film. You don't see your mother there, Kiera. It's we see you guys playing. Were you the one on the alligator, the crocodile? Yeah.
Yeah, I was, yeah.
So
I'm
you
in
see
all the
the
clips, yeah.
see all the happy memories, but you don't see your mom. So the embodiment of your mom is not there. It's quite disembodied. But yeah, what inspired you to do this particular poetry video?
Yeah, so the clips from this are from a home video that my mom took sometime in the early 1990s. And we were at home together watching it and laughing about everything in it. And I just noticed this absence of her. And she was not in any of our home videos. Even in clips where my father is there, she was always the one behind the camera. The only part that you heard of her was her voice sometimes telling us to do something or to be careful or things like that. And so I started to think about this a lot and to think about her life back then. And we lived in Southern Ontario, close to the 401. And so I started to think about what this would have been like for her. And my mother struggled with alcohol addiction for a good chunk of her life. And it became a lot worse after she became a mother. And my father was away doing field work a lot of the time for his job. And so she had 3 young children at home in a very isolated part of Southern Ontario, in rural Southern Ontario, and started to drink more to cope with this sort of loneliness and the struggles that she had just learning how to be a mother without a community of support around her. And so I wrote this about that, and it seemed only fitting to use these videos that had been the inspiration as part of the poetry film as well.
Thank you, Kiera. Chaucer, Helen, you are the editors of Poetry Film Live, and you come across so many different poetic stories. Do you have any thoughts on what Kiera just presented?
Yeah, well, I absolutely loved it. Really did. It was moving and and quite unique in. I loved the voice because if you read the poem, you'd read the voice in a certain way, the speaker of the poem, and then when you see it with the children on the screen, it just adds a layer that makes it kind of it's kind of magic. It just comes alive. It's that thing I think that film can add to poetry, and give it that extra thing. But I think it was really effective with that poem and that footage coming together, and yeah. And lots of footage, that archive footage doesn't, well, it rarely has the camera person in it. So usually footage from a bit further back than that would be the husband filming the wife. So you'd get that repetition of, the wife turning and smiling she's thinking, oh, just put the camera away, we're on holiday. You didn't get that so much from the children. It was more that the photographer, the film person making the film was absent, and it was just the children, and it was the voice of the child. Magical. Loved it. Well done.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Helen. Georgia, Nidhi, any thoughts? After watching both the films?
I'm thinking it goes back, both are kind of tied to memory in many ways. And I think it shows to me the power of poetry in that it's very reflective, and that, that you're able to connect this embodiment of your mom, like where she's present, but not like, but she's the one who's recording, right? Like that clip of, so she's there, but she's also playing. And to me, it was more like if she's recording, then she's playing this motherly role in a sense, because she wants to capture those moments and not lose them. But it's very interesting to me because your memory connected it with her struggle at that point. So like, so, but in her mind would have been like, oh, I'm so proud of my kids. Like I'm filming them. So that's the sense I got from that visual. And it's very interesting to me because like I follow a lot of like YouTube like families nowadays. So like we follow like these like influencers, like our would be influencers, and there are two specific contrasts that I found. So there's a Pakistani family that does a lot of travel or whatever, and then so the father is disembodied in that. The father you never see. He's the voice, he's the narrator, and and he's always talking with the wife and the kids, and he's like, oh yeah, we're going to Bagoda, or we're going to this thing, but you never see the guy. And there was a video about him having a stroke, and you thought, okay, maybe here we'll see him. He's still not there. It's just the wife the whole time just standing there and then saying, okay, yeah, sure. And then in contrast to that, there's another YouTube family called Backpack Family, and they're like these hiker teachers, and there everybody's involved. You see like the father coming in, and so, but to me, I noticed that I wonder if it was cultural to an extent, or there was a little bit of shyness or whatever. So, but this idea that like the dynamics and like how they change, and like in terms of like how a person is conveying themselves, um so that's what like I kept on thinking about. Like that was my immediate connection, was like when you said the disembodied like mother, like there, and I kept on thinking about that father. Like I was like, the whole time he's the narrator. If you go to his channel and you see all of his videos, that's all he does, is that he's like, okay, so let's go to this lounge. Oh, okay, like his, like, what do you think about this? What do you think about, so the family is like his main focus. He isn't. But there's a certain amount of pride, I think, in it. But there's also that anxiety that comes across, like, where do you want to be on the screen or not? So I think like there's so much like complexity that's tied to it. So that's what my initial thoughts were. Sorry, I get derailed. These things.
Oh, that was funny.
No, these are the connections. Like, so it's very funny how visuals work, because like, I mean, YouTube, like, and the other connection is like when in the 90s, like these were all home videos, like these were private videos. Nowadays, like families are making videos for monetary value. Like they have changed now, and then those videos are also functioning as their home videos, but also something that they can share with the world, which never used to happen before. So it's a very interesting contrast between the two. So I think I'm awake now, so I can at least like say that. But yeah,
my YouTube is purely for archive. Most of the time, it's just to archive very serious either dance or films. But just going back to Kiera and Chaucer's films, I do feel it's not just about revisiting the memories of the past. It's also about creating new memories. That's creating like a new future within the present moment. And it reminded me of actually when Nidhi was talking about memories and what comes out of it, reminded me of our last Best Film Award winner, Ashley McDonald. at our film festival, and she did a film about sexual assault. It wasn't just her story. She talked about what others experienced on that same day. And one of the things that she mentioned during the Q&A was very powerful. And she said, it's now about creating more like good times, more happy times than just living with that one memory that she had. So I think we were talking about moving ahead, and it's very, very difficult. And sometimes a lot of the themes that we represent in films and poetry is underrepresented. Like what Kira shared with us, that's not widely spoken about. You know, the struggles. We glamorize, you know, like the representations of the family in terms of like how happy it is, you know, like how happy, how positive, how perfect it is. You know, we always see curations of, you know, family pictures and videos as something very positive, but we don't think about the struggle. And I think our parents probably never wanted us to think about the struggles either. So now, personally, I am facing a lot of shock myself, like how a lot of humans, whether they're family members or not, like they're so, you know, hypocritical actually. And so, or, you know, just the situations are just so, you know, they're so contested. But growing up, we never really thought about that. So those were some of my thoughts, you know, when I saw Chaucer's film and Kira's film. Like, you both so powerfully displayed what's often underrepresented and not talked about.
I really loved the film. I thought it was beautiful. It was really the underlining thing of the disappearing mother, even though that she's behind the camera, which was quite interesting because that's quite agency. She's got agency, but her being alcoholic, her issues around having children and not being able to mother in the way that, you know, you mother, which isn't talked about very much either. Or well, it is and it isn't. I think that's you brought a very good point up with the absent. I wrote a poem, Knees were stools for feet, about the disappearing mum, that she's has to be on standby, and her children, you know, you don't have the mother. She's not a person. She's an object for, a bit like parasitical, like you know, if you want to stretch it, the children are quite parasitical, and there is no mother, although no person left. And actually articulating that and being honest and owning that and saying, actually, for some of these people, some people just can't do it, or don't, you know, or if they do it, they wish they hadn't, or they're just not wanting to go down that route. And it's really important to not celebrate, but to look at that part of, say, your the mother in it, and talk about and write about how the difficulties around that, and own it a bit more, because it isn't easy. It's incredibly difficult job to pick up children, and the alcoholism as well, and her isolation, how isolated she must have been, and what that and that having children can isolate you. You know, you think you're all together, and as Samita said, all happy families, but it's not. It's really not. You know, in a lot of cases. So it's a brilliant film. I loved it, and I loved the voiceover. And I love the voice. I think the voice was just great.
Thank you. Yeah. A lot of what all of you have said is making me think a little more deeply about the film. And it occurs to me too that when my mother was making these home videos, she was probably trying to capture those moments when the family felt more like she wanted it to be all the time, that sort of idealized version, right? That happy version. So I had not thought much about what she was trying to do with those home videos before. You think you're just capturing the family and things, but those were all it's kind of like the highlight reels of today, of our social media, right? In some ways. But yeah, I think there's just something so interesting too about memory work here, because as children, we had no idea that she was struggling, right? She always gave us the best version of herself that she could give. And she did give a lot of herself into motherhood, and she really loved it. But like you said, Chaucer, it takes up your identity, and you become the mother and not the person, the sort of fully fledged human that you were before. And I think that's where she really struggled with that, as well as with some personal trauma of her own that she was still working through. And then the isolation on top of that, because we had one neighbor who we didn't really speak to very much, and nobody else around for quite a while. So really out in the middle of the country, in the middle of nowhere, and further away from her family. It was a couple-hour drive to go visit her family. So just these sort of compounding elements that made motherhood such a struggle for her, even though it was something she valued and wanted. Yeah.
Did you talk? Did you talk to her about it? I mean, have you spoken to her since?
Yes, actually, that's a really great point. We talk about it regularly, and I always get her permission to write about things that have to do with her, and I run everything by her before I present it anywhere. And so she reviewed this video before I submitted it, and she loved it, and she loves this poem, and she thinks it's just a really strong exploration of the challenges that she faced, and she's happy that it's out in the world to talk about it more, because especially in the 90s, we didn't talk about motherhood being difficult and challenging in these ways. So yes, and she collaborates on some poetry with me as well, so she's an active participant in the poetry now. Yeah,
that's amazing.
Brilliant. Yeah, well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Yeah, that's really wonderful, because a lot of times when I'm doing film or dance, I often think about my mom, because she didn't have access to the kind of technologies we did. She didn't have access to the space. So I'm really happy to hear, Kira, that your mom is part of your creative process. And so many of us didn't have access in the past, but now, you're making it, you're making the stories accessible and inclusive. And so that's really, really powerful. Georgia, any thoughts on Kira's poetry video?
Yeah, the word that jumped out to me the most, first of all, it was very beautiful. And I love the home videos and that whole, I feel like as a millennial child, like the VHS like home video is so iconic for my childhood experience and so many of my friends as well. But the word that jumped out to me was lineage, and like I guess like that word alone just like opens up so many doors in my mind of like, oh, your mother is just one mother in a long line of mothers who have only ever been perceived as mothers. Like you said, they lose their identity. But I think it's so beautiful that not that you need her approval, but like she wants to participate in your art and your creation. And I think that is the best case scenario, because I don't know if you've uncovered, or anyone on the panel, in doing the research and the self-excavation, unpacking all the trauma and trying to find a way to convey it in any medium, whether it's visual or through writing or music or what have you, that excavation can be so hard to do alone. And to have a friend or a family member or a teammate or whoever, but like to not be alone and isolate yourself because of trauma or what have you. So it's so beautiful through both of these works. I think that there has been so much collaboration and appreciation for each other through the process of the excavation.
Can I also add one more point? I was thinking about, I'm working on a paper on bystander witness for a conference next week. And one of my arguments in that has been that, at least in the Indian context, like when it comes to sexual assault and things, the we we create these like sometimes very empowering films. So there's a particular film that I'm talking about, but and that in many ways, what I argue is that because it's such a feel good film, we don't take action in real life because of that. But then when I was thinking about these two films, the poetry films, I kept on thinking about how that's different, like because how in both of them it's that, because it's on everyday life, right? It's ongoing and stuff, and even with issues of confronting the past or confronting a history, where you yourself like switch from being the person who experienced it to being an onlooker, sort of like having distance from it, and then taking action in a way to create healing. So using that medium as a way to heal, like, so that's what I thought was a big contrast between, say, a commercial film that's a feel good film, like where you're completely distant from because it's something that's shown, it's a multiplex, like bigger thing, versus like these like intimate smaller films that give you more that shift. So where I think it allows for the viewer also to start healing, which I don't think like bigger commercial films like have that power. So that was something I thought about where the spectator transforms into a bystander witness when they're watching trauma. So the film I'm talking about is called Darlings, and it's about domestic violence and how it's very uncomfortable when we watch it. But then we feel like in many ways we can like kind of distance ourselves from it, like once the survivor fixes it and it's on her, and we say, okay, oh great, she's empowered, she can fix it. But we don't really address the elephant in the room, that it shouldn't be on her, it should be the society, ensuring that a man doesn't, or whoever the perpetrator doesn't treat that person that way. um but then here, because it's a smaller medium and it's a shorter film, it's very intimate. So where I feel like I can start healing because those words, because poetry has that healing power versus a commercial film would. So that just a small nuance that I observed, just because I'd worked on that paper yesterday. So my brain is like still thinking about it. But that's but yeah, so like this idea of us as being bystander witnesses rather than spectators, like consumers of the
Yeah,
I
I
think
agree
that's
with that. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I was just going to say, picking up on that point, that's really interesting about being a bystander, because people have asked us if our film is available to see online, which it isn't, and for various reasons. And one of the reasons is the what I've observed when it's been shown in a with people watching it with other people. You get the usual sort of there's moments where somebody laughs and then other people feel that they can join in. So you get that community thing. But also it's two things. There's the people that can't deny that they've seen it because they've come with their family or friends, or somebody's dragged them in, and so they've seen it, and they've the person sitting next to them knows that they've seen it. So then they are at some point, either straight afterwards or on the way home or whenever, they have to talk about it, they have to say something about it. And I think also the person that may see it who it triggers some memory or some experience that they've had, can then turn to the person next to them and say, yeah, that I understand that. Or they say to the person next to them, that happened to you, didn't it? And it can open up conversations. So in terms of there is no room for bystander if it's shown in a public arena, as far as I can tell.
What I think of when I was thinking about it was not just the conversation part. For me, it was the action part, because I was thinking about it in terms of like rape cases. Like, so in India, like for example, when in 2012 there was a major rape case that happened, and people like did not, like, there were 30 to 35 people who were standing with the witnesses, but nobody acted on it. So for me, like, to that point, I agree, like, that there is a discussion, but when it comes to actions, like, what happens? Like, so I mean, those are just questions that I'm posing, because I felt that, because that film came around the same time when there was a major, um, uh, so this is regarding the Bilkis Bano case that happened. So both of them came around 22, and 22 was when the film came, and then around that time there was this major case where 11 convicts were freed. But then the outrage in the media was not towards that. It was towards, the film, and like they were lauding the same Muslim woman who was, doing the thing, and everybody's like, oh, she's so empowered, blah blah blah, which is great. I agree, but at the same time, there was no outrage towards a real Muslim woman, who had been that. So that's where my observations were coming from, in terms of like how, what is our role from as audiences, and thinking about that. Like, ultimately it's like, when we consume, what happens after that is what my discussion, like what I'm trying to get at. But it's still a work in progress, so it's just a new idea. So I don't know.
No, it's something that I do think about, and when I'm writing the novel with Georgia, and also when I'm doing the film, and the script of the film is supposed to be one of the chapters of the novel, I do think about, everybody. Like, the story is just not mine. This story is not about just one woman or just one man. The story is everybody's. And a lot of times when we watch commercial films, we do resonate on many levels, but then we walk away not necessarily empowered, like what action we take. Now, when we watch more independent films, I think they don't have the same limitations that commercial films would have. Like, they're more accessible, they're more inclusive, they engage on many different levels, because a lot of the narrative structures are broken down in independent films. So I think people have more opportunities to engage and become an active participant. For example, like, just from my experience at the film festival, like, the viewers become active participants, and they actually, a lot of times, they end up co-creating. So the journey of the stories don't end, they continue. So thank you, Nidhi, for noticing that. I think it makes me think also, as I write, film, and curate. So I think ultimately, when it comes to like representing stories that are not really talked about, they're underrepresented. Maybe somewhere, we want the society to be more, together, I guess, to connect with the society, like have more of an engaged community. So that's where storytelling can be very powerful. And I felt both films we watched today were really powerful, very inspiring. It's like we're not just resonating with the characters in the film. I feel like somewhere we are exactly like them, and we're outside the films, like we're watching as a third person, but we're also like very much those characters. So these are just some initial impressions I have. Like, I feel I could speak more and more. We're over 1 hour right now, and I wanted to ask for any final thoughts before we walk away today. Any final thought or impression?
I just want to say about just thinking about, we have a commercial film like Pretty Woman, Pretty Woman. Apart from the obvious of it, against ours, it's all sewn up, and there isn't anywhere to go with it. It's all done and delivered, and that's it, and that's the narrative, and that's what you go away with, and then you do have one like an independent film. You do have where ours, which it isn't going down that route, in those things. So I see quite a lot of issues around, juxtaposing those two together. It's quite interesting. And keeping those knots in, as Noir Al-Sadia said, keeping those knots in and don't have something perfect, and being able to go further and have a before and an after, because life isn't like that. You do have a before and after. And just with Kira, I just want to quickly say that it reminds me a little bit, your film, of my film that I made on my own, but Helen helped me a bit at the end, was Pearls. And Pearls, it was just talking about a mother and a son being disassociated from his mum. And that film is more than the sum of its parts, because although I used archive material, it by serendipity and the way that poetry film works in its magic, and independent films work in their magic, it brought my birth family together. So just by chance, I found the man in the film that I made, the voiceover is my nephew, my birth nephew, and I hadn't realised, because I'd never met him before, but he works in television and on radio, so I've been hearing his voice for years, but not knowing he was my nephew. And when he turned up because of a family issue, I asked him to do the voiceover, which he did. And in the film, the woman that's in the film looks like my birth mum, but I didn't realise that at the time. And so when I saw it on big screen, I thought, oh my God, she looks like my birth mother, who I'd only met a couple of times. And so somehow or other, it brought all the family, this sort of birth family, which I didn't know, all together as a family unit. I mean, it's all blown apart now. I mean, there aren't any happy families. We're not all speaking, we're estranged again, but nevertheless, it was all brought together. So poetry film is so magic. It can do things other than just tell a story. It can do other things as well. I am finding that side of things, working with people and the way that things happen. We've got another one about France, where somebody's in France and they saw our film and connected it with an image and said, oh, I'm in France, so this is the image. So it can really speak across the world. The way it brings things together is just fantastic. I love it. And I love what your films, both films, yeah.
Yeah, it crosses boundaries and opens up space. When it comes to engaging the community and bringing more equality in the society, I feel it does open up a lot of space in a very unspoken way. And this reminded me of the last conference that we did in New York with the Kira and Nidhi. And we did find a lot of significance of the use of visual evidence, and so much of it is nonverbal and silent. I feel spoken words can be very divisive sometimes, but poetry films have the power of using silence, and I love the use of nonverbal communication. Any final thoughts, Georgia, Nidhi, Helen, before we run today? Any final thought?
I just want to say, I just want to put in Mary Russell and Gerard Vozak of Mercury Emotion. It was their belief, they said, that visual and literary art carry spiritual, political and sociological messages, and that visual poetry is a physical manifestation of what it means to be a human being engaged in seeking community, and that the medium of poetry film is intrinsically magic and alchemic. I just thought I'd put that in.
It
summarizes it.
And enables us to unfold in ways that, social narratives may never have informed us. So there's a lot of becoming also. And speaking of becoming, I have a dance training coming up. And so I'm a little distracted right now. It's like I feel very poetic with the dance, and but I do have to run, just walk in the snow for like 20 minutes. It's a private training that I got, and so. But yeah, I have so many thoughts coming in, and I would really encourage everybody to visit the Poetry Film Live. Is that what it's
Yes.
called, Helen? Chaucer?
Yes.
Poetry
Yes.
Film
Poetry
Live,
Film
because
Live.
there's so much there, and so many ways to engage. I find it very engaging, and so I was really happy that I was able to host today's screening and talk. Chaucer and Helen, I've been counting down for this for months now. And it was it was a New Year special that I was looking forward to. Any final thought, Georgia and Nidhi and Kira?
Just thank you so much for sharing with us today and for including me on this panel. I've really enjoyed myself. What a great way to start the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, same. And Chaucer and Helen, I just want to say it was really great to see your work and to learn from both of you more about this very interesting and beautiful medium of poetry film.
Thank you. You too. Yeah.
Thank you for having me as well. I was just going to say that Chaucer and Helen, I think because I teach freshman English as well. I'm not teaching it this year, but now in the fall. And I was tempted to, what I might end up doing is if you have access to a film that I could use in the class to get students engaged in it, because I've noticed that, it's again the letter word versus the visual, and how they get, especially like nowadays with attention spans running lesser and lesser and lesser over time. So but I was thinking of like using one of your poems or your film to teach students, because I think it'll be really powerful for them. And if you would ever want to come to my class and speak, I would be honored as well. So those were my final thoughts. Yeah. And
Okay, we'll be in touch.
yeah, would love that.
Yeah.
So thank you, Samita, for introducing us, and seeing Kira and everyone again.
I remember you teach poetry. You're passionate about poetry and fiction in general. So, so yeah, I'm really happy that we got to share this time, and what a wonderful way to start the new year. We're all on social media, either X or Instagram. So please feel free to connect there and keep the dialogue going, because I feel we need so much more of this.
Yeah.
So we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining, and have a wonderful start to the weekend and the new year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thanks. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.